is One Health. This looks at the coalescence of the human, animal, and environmental health. One Health approaches center the interconnectedness of human, animal, and environmental health. By better understanding the relationship between the living world, impacts on human health come into sharper focus. Things like zoonotic diseases, which we are familiar with, of course, thanks to COVID-19, food safety and security, and environmental health, among other topics. What might a One Health approach reveal about mental health? This panel will examine the ways in which animals and the environment shape migrants and refugees' mental health experiences post-displacement. It will consider how intentional interventions can breathe life into migrants and refugees' connections with others and their new world. And due to the location of our panelists, this panel will be remote, so we look forward to welcoming them. I'll hand it over to Dr. Zaman, who will be moderating. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the fact that our colleagues are all virtual, so this may be slightly different from some of the previous sessions. Given that we are slightly behind time, and myself included, and Dr. Benjamin Thomas White have to leave in about 40 minutes, I would ask our colleagues to, if you could just sort of have shorter answers so that we could engage the community a little bit more. I'll also have shorter introductions than was originally planned. This is normal in conferences to run a little late, but I just wanted to make sure that we don't sort of carry that forward. So the three, so my name is Mohammed Zaman. I'm a professor of biomedical engineering and global public health at Boston University, and also lead the BU initiative on forced displacement. I work on sort of One Health issues in the form of sort of the impact of environment, environmental health, animal health, and human health converging together, particularly in infectious diseases, less so in mental health, but certainly in the context of infection and exposure to infection. I'm joined by three wonderful panelists, Meg, Daley, Olmert, who's a science advisor, the Big Fix Uganda's Comfort Dog Project. Meg is an expert on the neurobiology of human-animal bond and its therapeutic effects. In 2009, her groundbreaking book, Made for Each Other, the Biology of Human-Animal Bond, was published to international acclaim. In 2015, she became the scientific advisor to the Comfort Dog Project in Uganda, the first animal-assisted trauma therapy in Central Africa. Joined with Meg is Dr. Benjamin Thomas White, who's also a very good friend, senior lecturer of history at Department of Humanities, University of Glasgow. Dr. White teaches history at the University of Glasgow and is a Middle East historian by background. He now works on refugee history in the world at large. His current research focuses on the history of refugee camps, and other recent publications include work on the history of humanitarian evacuation and the relationship between humans and animals in displacement. He is also one of the editors of refugeehistory.org. Third is Dr. Clare Rishbeth, senior lecturer, Department of Landscape Architecture at the University of Sheffield. And Dr. Rishbeth is a senior lecturer in the department. Her primary research areas in migration and place, encompassing the themes of belonging, familiarity, and unfamiliarity, experience of racism, recreation, and nature connections. She has led the research project Refugees Welcome in parks, including fieldwork in the UK and Germany. With that, I'll start with sort of questions for our panelists. And I gather that there are sort of chat functions for those who are online to ask any questions and sort of discuss with us in that regard. All right, so in terms of the first question, perhaps to Dr. White, animals and the environment historically have shaped the ways in which refugees are displaced and how hosts manage flows. Can you tell us a little bit about your research in the historical context? I know you've done some really incredibly insightful work in the context of Iraq and Bakuba and elsewhere. So tell us a little bit more about sort of animals in the context of displacement and refugees and refugee camps.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Mohammed, and thanks for the invitation to be here, everyone. When people are displaced, they take animals with them. We're seeing that at the moment. People leaving Ukraine are taking their pets with them, and this is now a well enough established phenomenon that arrangements are being made for those pets, better arrangements indeed than have been made for African students, for example, who are leaving Ukraine and being stopped as they try to do so. People take their pets. And people take their livestock animals, their working animals. So whatever the kind of population that's being displaced, of human population that's being displaced, there are likely to be animals traveling with them. And indeed, there may well be animals carrying them on their way or carrying their possessions. That means that animals need to be taken into account when people are hosted as refugees. If people keep animals in shelters that are not arranged to suit them, poultry, for example, then it's likely to be harder than it otherwise would be to maintain sanitary conditions. If working animals or livestock animals are not looked after in, for example, refugee camps, if there isn't access for them to grazing, or they're not provided with foodstuffs, conditions for everyone, for people and animals alike in the camp, are likely to worsen. The examples that I've worked on this relate to the period after the First World War in the Middle East, but it's true today. It's been true around the world since then. This also means that environmental hazards to displaced populations include hazards to their animals. For example, if an example that I'm familiar with is that herds of sheep and goats brought down from the Anatolian highlands during the First World War into the lowlands of what became Iraq were living in quite different climatic conditions. This is often an issue that arises with displaced animals. They were exposed to conditions that made it harder for them to thrive. Animals in such a situation can also then increase health risks to the displaced populations, for example, by providing a reservoir of infection for malaria, which can then be transmitted to the people accompanying them. All of these sorts of things need to be taken into account when refugees are displaced and animals are taken with them, and partly because the people who are in charge of humanitarian agencies are typically people from elements of global society that are most removed from regular interactions with animals. Humanitarian agencies have been very slow to work this kind of stuff out and to make accommodations for animals as well as people. They have done so in recent decades, but it was a long time coming. I think I'll stop there. That's plenty.
Great. Next question, perhaps both to Meg and Claire. Thank you, Ben. The connection between humans, animals, and environment is not just anecdotal. It has scientific foundation. In some of our own work in urban slums in Pakistan and elsewhere, we see the environmental impact and sort of both in terms of developing of drug resistance or infection that particularly impacts refugee communities. But from your perspective, humans, animals, and environment, can you tell us a little bit more about the science behind it and how you view some of that science, and how can one health approach that sort of puts all of these three in interconnected nodes could be translated to analysis of mental health? Let's start with you, Meg.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Well, I would just say that the human-animal bond runs on the same bonding that the human-human bond runs on in the brain. So these bonds are very profound. And to Dr. White's point, when people can't take their animals with them, it is traumatic. These are bonds that are broken. Domestication created profound bonds between humans and people. Humans and animals. And it's very similar to losing your family and the place that you live. It all runs on the same brain chemistry of attachment. So we become attached to the place we live, the people we live with, the animals we live with, we become attached to our ideas and our cultures. So dislocation is quite an interesting word that was used earlier. And so the bond is profound. The injury to the social brain network that comes from losing our animals and not having them with us after we form this bond can be very profound. The program I'm working with in Uganda is an extreme there, which is quite interesting because their people never formed social bonds with their dogs. And what we're doing is a One Health promotion, because that terrible civil war those people suffered destroyed their social connections profoundly. 70% of people are traumatized still from that war. And so what we're trying to do is immediately talk to the zoonotics. If you're afraid that a dog is going to kill you because of rabies, get rid of the rabies first. Now, there's a lot of reasons, you know, obviously rabies can and should be gotten rid of immediately. But once you remove that fear, then people can start to begin to look at the animals in a different manner. And that's what we've done for them. We've shown them, look, no, let's take the fear away. And now look at this dog, and you'll see the possibility of social connection with this dog that is so profound. And these dogs who have been traumatized throughout history there, they transform. They become trusting and trustworthy. And the people that we teach how to engage with them, it reignites their social brain networks and builds empathy and builds a sense of safety and connection. When people have destroyed your sense of trust in others, when you are stigmatized, when you are reviled, if you can find love, which we have to do as social mammals, we have to be able to give love and receive it. If you can find it in a dog, that's what dogs are wired for. Their social brain networks look closer to like ours than chimpanzees. That is a great evolutionary coincidence that we can tap into. So that's what we do in the Comfort Dog Project of Uganda. We teach people, we make their dogs safe, we teach them how to interact with them, and their PTSD symptoms drop dramatically because we do follow that. And they join, and it's extraordinary. I'm watching the human dog evolution roll out in 20 weeks. I'm watching evolution happen. And it makes people more empathetic, and it softens them. They learn to play again. They've been robbed of their childhoods. We re-engage the brain system, not unlike those psychedelics. Psychedelics in dogs are the two most effective treatments that have been discovered for trauma. So I would just mention, and that's the One Health. Healthier animals, healthier people. We have fates that cannot be disentangled, that cannot be broken. We are one.
Thank you. Over to you, Clare.
Yeah, so I'm a landscape architect, and I don't have a particular expertise in health. So I guess what's useful for me to throw into the conversation is how can other professions engage with health agendas and work in partnership. And the particular project of refugees welcome in parks was what in the UK anyway is called follow-on funding. It was from original research, and then there was a bit more funding to look at the impact of that. And so that's what this was. We weren't in some ways doing original research, though we fitted a few bits in. And our key question was, how can people and organisations who are supporting refugees think more broadly about outdoor places as part of methods of support and methods of integration? And then the flip side of that, how can people who work in the green space sector, park managers, landscape architects, people, wildlife trusts, that kind of thing, how might they be inclusive and actively support the engagement of refugees and asylum seekers? And we were working in UK and Northern Europe, Germany context. So we were particularly in these contexts, refugees and asylum seekers, certainly in 2017 when I was doing this, were from countries that were quite ecologically, culturally different. So we're dealing with people for whom often the kind of types of green spaces you have in the new environment are quite different, quite unfamiliar, culturally and ecologically. And to see a kind of use of open space as a kind of cultural act that has connections with other parts of your life, but also might have disconnections. So just, I mean, in terms of methods, we were doing a lot of we did some interviews with refugees and asylum seekers in London, Berlin and Sheffield, but we also did quite a lot of interviewing people who were stakeholders in this area, so like the Red Cross or City of Sanctuary, people supporting refugees, and then also different green space managers to learn what is being done, what seems to work, what doesn't seem to work, what are the barriers that are being experienced. And health was, so the well-being side of that, I have also been part of research projects on benefits of access to green space and nature and connections with that. I was quite, to be honest, I was quite nervous about that as a sort of statement when thinking about refugees arriving with post-traumatic stress and the multitude of different issues that are impacting them when they arrive in the UK in a kind of hostile environment, language, city rights, civil rights, etc. And one of the things we had to kind of get over was trying not to say that this is the most important thing that, say, refugee support services are dealing with. But what did come out of it was the refugees themselves talking about how it was helpful to be outdoors when the conditions are right. Not everybody, not all the time. Sometimes it's not the right thing, but people finding some sense of calm or finding some sense of play or release or a time to be more themselves, or simply a slight escape from very unsatisfactory housing conditions. So it emerged, I would say, with quite a few provisions in relation to that. So that was kind of part of what we then seek to articulate, was that being outdoors can be a way of feeling better, can be a way of joining in with society, but often possibly with a bit of extra support or information to start off with.
So let me turn the question on the other side. In your own sort of experience, Ben and Claire and Meg, the disruption of those connections with animals and the environment, how have they impacted the migrants and refugees displacement experience? So let's start with you, Ben, in terms of sort of what do the archives say? What do the sort of diaries, oral histories, and other experiences tell us that when those connections are severed, what is the impact? Economic, I would say sort of emotional, and other dimensions?
Oh, sorry, I'm just processing what Meg and Claire said, which is all extremely interesting and also immediately set off connections to things that I've encountered in my own research. Different ways in which connections with animals and the environment impact refugees' displacement experiences. I already said a few things about what happens with their own animals. In a project I coordinated about humans and animals in refugee camps, one of the things that came up was the case of the Abu Shauk camp in what was then Sudan. I think it's in South Sudan now, in 2003, where something like 14,000 donkeys carried over 50,000 people and their possessions into internal displacement. And within 18 months, over 80% of those donkeys had died because they hadn't been adequately provided for in the camp, meaning that the people they'd carried lost their means of a livelihood and their means of traveling home, a livelihood whether in exile or at home, and their means of traveling. That's a particularly brutal and stark example of a very common thing. Animals in displacement can then also become a source of tension with host communities. The example I studied in most depth historically of Assyrian refugees from the Anatolian highlands in what was becoming Iraq, so a camp that was just north of Baghdad. The herds that they brought with them had managed to survive. They were relatively small for the size of the human population because the conditions of the journey had been so awful. They arrived in the summer and autumn of 1918, so just at the end of the First World War. By the following spring, they were starting to recover. And goats and sheep, especially goats, as anyone who's kept them will know, are no respecters of fences. As these herds of a few thousand animals rapidly growing in size were taken out for grazing each day in the area around the camp, they were breaking into farmers' fields and eating the crops that were beginning to emerge in the spring. There are all sorts of examples of tensions like that arising as displaced animals are jostling for their own space in what is often an already densely inhabited human and animal ecology. More recent examples, I know of a practitioner, Charles Hoots, who was working in South Sudan in the 2010s, where a displaced refugee population with their own animals needed to find a space for themselves, not just with the local farm and livestock animals, but also with the herds of nomadic communities that regularly passed through the same region. And some quite complex juggling had to be done after tensions had led to several deaths. In order to shift migratory routes for the nomadic population a bit, to arrange times at which people would access watering spaces for their flocks. And these things are really important because human-human conflict can easily arise from animals in displacement. There are obviously all sorts of ways in which bodily and mental health can be impacted directly, but Meg has already spoken about some of those. The last thing I'd like to mention then is also interactions with other animals in the environment, which can be tense. One of the largest refugee camps in the world at the moment is at Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, where after renewed persecution of Rohingya people in Myanmar, about 1 million people fled across the border into Bangladesh in 2017. Certainly it was 750,000 within a few weeks, and it's about 1 million now. So an enormous camp appeared, not just in an area that was already densely populated and farmed, but that also was on a traditional migration route, not for humans, but for the critically endangered population of Asian elephants in Bangladesh. And at first, the elephants tried to follow their normal migration route through the camp. There were a number of deaths in the autumn of 2017 as a result. And so there was a project coordinated by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature and UNHCR, basically to create better relations between the people in the camp and the elephants that lived locally and were passing through, partly by putting in place watchtowers and warning systems, but also through arts-based methods and so on, through familiarizing the humans in the camp with the animals in their new landscape. Though that gives a sense of some of the extremely wide range of ways in which connections with animals in the environment impact migrants, refugees' experiences.
Great. Thank you so much, Ben. Meg, over to you. I think you're still muted, Meg. If you could just unmute yourself.
I did, sorry.
Yep.
That's amazing to hear. I would say that interestingly, I really enjoyed hearing about the green spaces, because I think, you know, those are public spaces too, and that's one of the few places that people can gather and maybe feel like they belong a little bit, or they're allowed to be there, as opposed to a lot of other places when people are relocated into foreign environments. So I really applaud that work, and I'm sure that if you've ever done studies looking at stress levels, you will see that there really are concrete therapeutic effects that people experience when they're in those spaces. So that's a big darn deal. I would just like to say that there's a couple of like really basic things I think that might cut across all of the work, and that is the social brain networks, the fact that safety, trust, and empathy, none of us are going anywhere without those. Those are the basic needs that we have to be social mammals, and we are social mammals. And whatever we can do to stimulate the sense of safety and something called social recognition. Now, I work very closely with a hormone called oxytocin. You can't be in the social brain business without being involved with oxytocin. And when I say oxytocin, it also involves dopamine and serotonin and the opioids and GABA and all of those. So it's a kind of a shorthand, but that one thing it does is promote social recognition. It allows you to see other as kin. Now, this is very important when a mother has a baby. You got to pick it up and go, that's me. That's what kicks in the, I'm going to care for it. I'm going to feed it. I'm going to protect it. I'm going to, you know, blah, blah, blah. So social recognition is what refugees are suffering from a lack of. They've lost their context. And now when they're not socially recognized, they can be seen as dangerous, because that's also part of the social brain network. We see it's hard to see others as kin unless we get to know them, unless we see them in parks and we see they're not dangerous. So we have to have enough time together in safe social places to recognize each other. I come from the Irish diaspora. We landed in New York and other places, and we were considered dangerous. So I would say that anything you can do to promote social recognition will have a very strong effect, because the social brain network is also the anti-stress brain network. So it's part and parcel. Once you feel calmer and more safer around people, you start to open up, you start to see that. That's why dogs can be so valuable in cities, or even animals anywhere. We have a very ancient predisposition to see that people who are trusted by animals are more trustworthy. So there's lots of reasons to bring animals into the picture consciously, now that we know a lot of this stuff, to be able to, just like using open spaces, to manipulate these things to greatest effect. And so that's what I would say.
Great. Claire, and then we'll take questions from people who are in person there, as well as please add any question in Q&A. Claire, over to you.
Yeah, so I mean, disconnections, I've already talked a bit about how green space is just different in different parts of the world. So when you move to a new place, you are slightly de-skilled. I mean, that's true for people going on exotic holidays. We just don't quite know. So how spaces are legible in terms of what you do and whether they're safe to go in. Just, I mean, like in the UK, a cemetery might also be a park. In another part of the world, that would not be the case. So there's a kind of set form of learning, but also whether you've made a good judgment about what you do in a space or not has different fear factor to it if you are an asylum seeker and you're worried about your legal status. So there's a kind of context of how you can take risks to explore and how that exploring can be less risky. That is important to overcome. Comfort and ease is important, and that may be about the weather, though actually we've found the weather, not necessarily quite as crucial as you might think. But I think, that issue of how people have experience of racism is important to acknowledge. Outdoor spaces are not always safe for everyone in the UK or in different contexts. And most refugees and asylum seekers will have had some experience of harassment or worse, or will know someone else. So how treating safety seriously, I think, is vital, and not worrying about safety is a privilege that many don't have. And then the third thing, just to say, is really that one thing pretty much, well, all refugees and asylum seekers have in common is a fractured social network. They come without everybody. So the idea that, and yet in many parts of the world, outdoor space is a highly social place to gather. So that's another issue of disconnection, is that you would normally go to an open space or hang out in open space with all your friends and family, and you do not have that social network here. So building social networks, or finding, in one of my papers I talk about curating sociability, can be one way to help kind of bridge that. Going with a friend can help a lot of those issues. So that's kind of where a lot of our strategies kind of were based on, is that idea of how you can help overcome some of those disconnections to give people confidence and a kind of trust in their own judgment about different use space, and then have fun, join in, be part of a crowd, be a footballer, be someone with a kid pushing a swing, be someone enjoying watching the robin. That's the win.
Great. So we have some questions as well, perhaps two questions, and I want to sort of take one and then sort of ask colleagues in audience. One question is sort of this about the fact that, well, animals are also going to be scared, perhaps because of the trauma of migration and all of that. And any thoughts on that? The fact that if you have, let's say, household animals, whether it is sort of cattle or horses or pets, the impact on animals in the sort of traumatic journey, and it doesn't have to be refugees across international state lines. It could also be within the country and IDPs, or among the stateless. So what do we know about that, and how do we sort of navigate? Let me start again with you, Ben.
Well, it's a big question, because there's very different ways that different animals, what you have to do to give them a sense of security. But yeah, I mean, animals, as Ben pointed out, can be a liability. Barking dogs are not always something that anybody wants around. A skittish large animal is dangerous. So of course, what we try to do at the Comfort Dog Project, because we start with dogs that are terrified of humans, and for good reason, and humans that are terrified of dogs for good reason. And we take one by one, we take those good reasons away, and we help them interact in positive and safe ways. And it is a problem. We are at the height of animal ownership in just pets, and people are more clueless about animal behavior to begin with. So there are issues about that. I would say that I cannot speak to large livestock issues, because my experience does not go that way. In Uganda, they were all killed, just like that, just killed. So just like those mules, or donkeys, and that's traumatic in itself, to see your animals die from, because they're not cared for or slaughtered. So all I would say is that animals can be a liability, and but because we know what an incredible benefit they can be, this is what I'm talking about, is leveraging that, getting in there, just like open space. How do we just take open space? In Africa, people meet under trees, under a tree. That's a meeting place. We want to leverage some of those things and take away the negative, and find ways to really leverage the positive effects. It can be done. You have to recognize them first.
Ben, please go ahead.
Mohammed, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, the impact of the trauma on animals and how it sort of shapes both human-animal interactions, whether the animals are sort of livestock or pets. This whole sort of process of moving, of being displaced. What have people written about that? What do we know in sort of the impact on animals as well?
My sense, of course, I'm most familiar with historical literature where there's little written about it. I think in some of the social science literature around refugees, there is more of a recognition, which, as I say, this is why there are now some systems in place recognizing that people will want to take their pets with them if they're displaced, and that if they can't take their pets with them in the context, to say, of a natural disaster as well as a human one, they'll stay where they are. This was witnessed in New Orleans in 2005, for example, in Japan in 2011. So that all sorts of ways in which if animals aren't supported, and if humans in their relationship with their animals aren't supported, then conditions are worse for humans and animals alike. Yeah, I could go on about that for ages though. That's all.
Claire, please go ahead.
I don't think my research really covers this, but I do have an animal story just to make the link in your direction, which is I was an asylum seeker living in Sheffield, and he'd only arrived a few months ago, and he used to feed the squirrels from his window. And squirrels, for those not in the UK context, are a bit of a pest, but also quite cute, and you find them in parks, but you're normally not supposed to feed them. And he kind of, I don't know whether he knew this or not. He basically said, I don't know whether you're supposed to feed them. But when I was in Iran, he was Iranian, I used to feed the cats all the time. And my mum used to kind of not let me, but then let me as well. And, you know, I am an animal lover. And I just thought there's something about being an animal lover that was really important to him. And for him, then feeding the squirrels was a way of him being himself. And I thought that was a really kind of heartwarming story. And who cares if it's not really a great idea to feed the grey squirrels?
This is such an important point, and it's one that many practitioners will have encountered, and that I've encountered. Two similar examples that I'll give, one from here in Glasgow and then one from the Middle East, but both involving Middle Eastern people displaced as refugees from the Middle East. A few years ago, a complex of the highest residential tower blocks in Glasgow was demolished. The Red Road Flats, 6 enormous, I think 30-story tower blocks that, you know, virtually visible from space. They'd been emptied gradually over the previous years, and for quite a while before they were demolished, the last people to remain living in them were asylum seekers dispersed from southern England and housed in Glasgow. And the last person actually to live in this whole mammoth complex was, I believe he was Iraqi asylum seeker named Ahmed, who became known as the Birdman of Red Road, because in this extraordinary bleak environment of a housing complex that was about to be demolished, he lived and he kept caged birds. When I started doing some research on this topic, I was talking with a friend who had done ethnographic field research in Jordan with people displaced from Syria. She was there in 2016-17, and in one of the most unfriendly and unlivable camps in Jordan. Most Syrian refugees in Jordan avoided camps, but the camp at Azraq, quite deep in the Jordanian steppe, far away from any towns or villages, very hostile environment of fixed fences, harder for refugees to adapt it in the way that they'd adapted the less formal camp at Za'atari, less formal and better known. My friend encountered caged birds for sale and they were for sale for a sum that would be, I think, about $50. In a context where people working as incentive workers, so refugees doing waged work for the humanitarian agencies in the camp, would be paid about $10 a day. So these were very valuable commodities, and one of the reasons for this is simply that, you know, a caged bird is a common pet in Syrian cities, and people who were living in shelters over which they had little control and less than their fellow Syrian refugees in other camps, because these were more rigid shelters that they weren't allowed to move, could make the shelter into a home by bringing a caged bird to it. And I think this is another good example of the importance of animals and the importance of the kind of bond that Meg was discussing.
Well, I would say that the science and stories like that, and YouTube, by the way, which has been an incredible data source, animals are what protect our humanity, and that's One Health right there. You may not, you know, it's something that we don't think about enough, but those stories, The Birdman of Alcatraz, that famous movie with Burt Lancaster, it is animals and nature in general, which is open spaces. That's what makes us humans. Now, human is humane. I mean, you want humane behavior in humans, you have to factor in humane behavior to animals and recognize that. And again, feed it, recognize it from day one with children, feed it. We don't come by empathy without training. And if you want to expand social recognition so that people or animals aren't immediately considered dirty, unsafe, you know, knowledge, we know the more we learn about things, the more of those walls just fall. And it makes me very sad when I hear about the refugee situation, because it reminds me of how dogs are treated in Uganda. You know, if you don't understand something, you're automatically afraid of it. And then you stigmatize it, and then you shun it, and then you just start to decompose that thing. So people mustn't be treated like animals, and animals need to be treated like people. Is that possible? But there's a humanity, there's a common, truly one health, one humanity in our ability to recognize our need for animals and their need for us.
Great. On that thought, thank you so much, everyone. I know it's late, certainly for our colleagues in the UK, and we also want to make sure that we don't add to the time and ensure that the next session runs on time. So Meg, Claire, Ben, thank you very much. I hope the conversation continues. Please do reach out. Thank you so much to Refugees in Town for the opportunity to engage. All the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.